My daughter-in-law married my son solely to claim my house, and soon after the wedding she arrived with intentions that reached further than I expected. What began as a simple welcome turned into a journey that reshaped my quiet days, leading me into discoveries of strength, patience, and truths that were only beginning to unfold. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. I was an old man, with only one treasure greater than my memories, and that was the house I built with my own hands. Brick by brick, year by year, through sweat, sacrifice, and long nights, I gave shape to the place I believed would shelter my family long after I was gone. It was not just a house of walls and windows, but a home of laughter, of quiet evenings with my wife, of my son's first steps and his first words. To me, it was sacred ground. Yet the day my son brought home his new bride, I felt something shift. She carried herself with grace and charm, but in her eyes was a spark I had seen before in others, a spark that measured things not by love or memory, but by value. The words she spoke were sweet, the smile never faltered, yet behind it all was a weight I could not place. As the days passed, I began to notice how her gaze lingered not on the faces around her but on the walls, the fixtures, the land outside. I would hear her footsteps moving slowly through the halls, as if she were taking inventory, not of photographs or heirlooms, but of what could one day be claimed. I tried to silence my doubts, because my son looked so happy, and in his eyes she was the perfect wife, the one he had waited for. So I sat quietly, watching, listening, waiting for what time would reveal. I reminded myself that my heart had endured many winters, and it could endure suspicion too, until truth either proved me wrong or proved me right. Yet deep within me, I felt that the days of peace in my home were numbered, and that the love I had for my son was about to be tested in ways that would shake the very foundation I had built my life upon. I still remember the very first time I met her, the woman who would become my daughter-in-law, and even in that moment, there was something I could not quite name that set me on edge. My son brought her through the door with the kind of pride only a man in love carries, his smile wide and his voice filled with eagerness as he introduced her to me. She stepped forward gracefully, her hands folded politely, her words carefully chosen to leave a good impression. She complimented the house, remarking on how warm and welcoming it felt, and she praised my cooking even though she had not yet tasted it. She laughed at my jokes, listened intently when I spoke of old times, and carried herself with the perfect balance of respect and charm. To anyone else, she would have seemed flawless, the kind of young woman any father would be glad to see by his son's side. Yet as I watched her eyes move across the living room, catching on the framed photographs and lingering on the sturdy wooden beams I had placed there myself, I felt as if she were studying more than just the home she stood in. It was as though she were measuring it, imagining it, calculating what it might mean to her one day. I told myself I was being unfair, that my years had made me too suspicious, that I should be glad my son had found someone who carried herself with grace and spoke with such kindness. Still, when I looked at her smile, I could not shake the thought that it was a smile that had been practiced many times before a mirror. She leaned close to my son when he spoke, her laughter rising in perfect rhythm with his, yet there was no softness in her eyes, no glance that lingered with affection. Instead, her gaze often returned to the walls, the furniture, the very bones of the house I had given my life to build. I welcomed her warmly, for it was my duty as a father to show my son my support. But as the evening ended and I sat alone by the fire after they had gone, I found myself staring at the flicker of the flames and hearing again the sharp echo of her words, sweet on the surface but heavy with something unspoken, something that would only grow clearer with time. When I look at my home, I do not see walls and windows the way others might. I see the story of my life, written in every nail, every board, every stone laid down with care. I was a younger man once, with dreams too heavy for my shoulders and hands rough from work that never seemed to end. I labored in the heat of summer and in the biting cold of winter, saving every coin, stretching every paycheck, and telling myself that one day it would all amount to something more than survival. When I finally stood on the patch of land I had purchased with years of sacrifice, I swore that what I built there would be more than a house. It would be a legacy. My wife and I lived humbly in those early years, often skipping comforts so we could buy materials, so we could push forward on the dream of a place our children would always call home. I remember her laughter as she painted the first room, her voice singing quietly as the brush moved along the wall, and I remember how proud she was the day we carried our son inside for the first time, a baby wrapped in a blanket, unaware that he was entering the heart of everything we had worked for. There were nights when my body ached so badly I could not sleep, nights when the roof leaked because I had not yet learned all the skills I needed, but I pressed on, learning, repairing, and building again. Over time, the house grew solid, the garden flourished, and the rooms filled with memories of birthdays, family dinners, and long evenings where love sat quietly in the air like a steady flame. My neighbors saw only the structure, but I saw the story, and I knew that each brick was a testament to every sacrifice made along the way. I wanted my son to one day understand that this home was not just given, it was earned through years of struggle and unyielding faith. That is why, when I saw my daughter-in-law glance around with eyes that measured rather than cherished, I felt a heaviness in my chest, for she could never understand what it cost to bring this place to life. And I feared that she would never honor the sacrifices that made it possible. The wedding day arrived with all the celebration one might expect, bright flowers lining the path, music filling the air, and guests dressed in their finest. Yet for me, it was a day of mixed feelings that would stay with me long after the last toast was made. I watched my son stand tall in his suit, his face glowing with the joy of a man who believed he had found the love meant to carry him through life. And I wanted so much to share in that happiness, to let it wash away the quiet doubts that had taken root in me since the first time I met her. She walked down the aisle with grace, her gown shimmering in the light, her smile flawless, her every step measured to perfection, and the crowd seemed enchanted by her presence. The vows were spoken with clarity, her voice steady and smooth, and when she looked at my son, she held his gaze as if no one else existed, though when her eyes flickered toward the seats, I noticed how often they lingered on me and then beyond me, toward the thought of the life she was stepping into. During the reception, her laughter rang out in perfect timing, her compliments showered on relatives who eagerly accepted her as one of their own, and her charm worked like a key that opened every heart in the room. Yet as I sat there, listening and observing, I could not ignore how her attention returned to me again and again, not with affection or warmth, but with a certain calculation that sent a chill through me, even amidst the celebration. I told myself it was a father's instinct, that perhaps I was guarding my son too closely, but when she came to me with her sweet words, thanking me for raising such a fine man, and remarking casually on how beautiful and strong the house must be where he grew up, I felt the weight of her intentions press against my chest. I smiled and offered my blessing, because that is what was expected of me, but deep inside I carried the certainty that this day was not only the beginning of their marriage, it was the beginning of a trial for me. A test of whether the home I had built with my own hands would remain a legacy or become a prize in someone else's game. Only a few days after the wedding, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, and when I opened the door, I saw my son and his new wife standing there, not with smiles of casual visit, but with luggage piled around them as if they were travelers returning from a long journey. My son greeted me with a warm hug, his voice cheerful, but her eyes darted past me and into the house, surveying the rooms as if she were already making herself at home. They did not ask if they could stay. They simply stepped inside with their bags, and in that moment I understood that this was not a visit. It was a declaration. My son spoke quickly about how it would be practical for them to live here for a while, how they would save money, and how it would give them time to plan their future, but I noticed it was not his voice carrying conviction, it was hers guiding the decision. She walked into the living room with confidence, setting her purse on the table and glancing at the furniture as though she were measuring it for changes. I stood quietly, reminding myself that a father's patience is sometimes the only bridge that keeps a family from breaking apart. I told them they were welcome for now, but deep inside I felt my chest tighten, for I had not been asked, I had been told. As evening fell, she moved through the kitchen as if testing the space, opening cupboards, running her fingers along the counters. And then she called it cozy, in a tone that felt less like praise and more like a promise of what she planned to alter. My son remained close to her, nodding to every word she said, as if her thoughts were his own, and though I wanted to take comfort in his happiness, I could not help but feel the weight of what had just begun. That night, as I sat alone in my chair while they settled into the guest room, I listened to the sound of their voices carrying down the hall, and I realized that the house I had built with sacrifice was no longer the sanctuary it had always been. It was now the stage upon which a new and unsettling chapter was about to unfold. From the very first morning after they arrived, I began to notice how quickly she moved to make the house her own, not with gratitude or care, but with a sense of quiet authority that unsettled me. She walked into the living room and shifted the furniture without asking, sliding the sofa against a different wall, moving the chairs to a new angle, and even taking down a photograph of my late wife, saying it would be better placed in another room where it would not dominate the space. I stood there silently, my hands gripping the armrest of my chair, my heart heavy as I watched her treat every corner of the home as though it were already hers to command. In the kitchen, she opened cupboards, set aside dishes she did not like, and began speaking about modern appliances that could replace the ones I had used faithfully for years. My son said nothing, only following her lead with a nod, and each time I glanced at him, hoping for even a flicker of hesitation, I found instead the soft gaze of a man completely wrapped in his wife's presence. She walked the halls slowly, almost ceremoniously, pausing at doors as though envisioning what each room would become under her influence, and I realized that her eyes did not see memories. They saw ownership. She praised the sturdiness of the house, the size of the garden, and the quality of the woodwork. Yet her words carried no warmth, only calculation, as if she were taking stock of her prize. I wanted to speak, to remind her that this house was more than walls and beams, that it was the very heart of my life's labor, but the silence clung to me because I knew my son's happiness hung in a fragile balance. That evening, when I returned to the living room, I found she had lit candles and arranged the space as though she were already the mistress of the home, smiling as she spoke about the gatherings they could host there. I listened quietly, yet inside me grew the unshakable knowledge that she had not married into our family for love alone. She had married into it with eyes fixed firmly on the house I had built, seeing it not as a legacy, but as a prize waiting to be claimed. It did not take long before her words began to carry a sharper edge. dressed in politeness but heavy with insult, as though she wanted me to know her thoughts without saying them outright. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, she glanced around and remarked that the curtains were far too old-fashioned, saying they made the house look stuck in another time. She laughed lightly after speaking, as though her comment was harmless, but I heard the weight in it and saw the small smile on her face as she looked to my son for agreement. He nodded quickly, eager to please, and my heart sank as I realized she had already begun shaping his view of the home he had grown up in. Another time, as she stood in the kitchen preparing tea, she tapped the counter with her fingernail and said the material was outdated, that soon they should think about remodeling because a house of this size deserved a modern touch. I listened quietly, my hands folded in front of me, holding back the words I wanted to speak, because I knew that once spoken, they could not be taken back. Even small details became targets for her tongue. The pictures on the wall she called cluttered. The garden, she said, would be better trimmed and simplified. The old armchair I used every night, she called worn and unsightly. Each remark was disguised as observation, but the sting was clear, and though she smiled when she spoke, her eyes never softened. My son never defended the house, never reminded her of the memories it carried, never spoke of the long nights of labor that had given it life. He only nodded or stayed silent, and that silence cut deeper than her words. I told myself I had endured harsher storms than this, that I could bear a few careless remarks, yet inside me grew a quiet flame of resolve. For I knew these were not simply opinions, they were steps in a plan to erase what I had built and replace it with her vision. That night, as I sat alone in the dim light, her words echoed in my mind, each one striking the walls of my home like small chisels, slowly carving away at the respect and love it once held, and I understood that the insults had only just begun. The more days passed, the clearer it became to me that my son no longer carried a voice of his own, for every word he spoke seemed to echo hers, and every decision he made was shaped by her hand. I would watch them at the dinner table, and though I asked him simple questions about his work or his plans, it was always she who answered first, and he would simply nod as if her response had been his all along. When she criticized the house, he never defended it, though he had grown up within these walls and knew every story behind them. Instead, he would look at her with gentle eyes, silently agreeing, as if afraid to upset her. I remembered him as a boy, bold and curious, full of laughter that filled the rooms, yet now he seemed diminished, his strength drawn out of him by a bond that left no space for his own will. One evening I asked him privately if he was happy, and he smiled quickly, assuring me that marriage was everything he had hoped for. But even as he said it, his eyes flickered toward the room where she sat, as though seeking permission for his words. That glance told me more than anything he said, for it revealed a man caught between love and control, unable to see the difference. I tried to remind him of the values his mother and I had taught him, of respect for family and the importance of standing firm when faced with challenges. But he brushed it aside with nervous laughter, insisting that I worried too much. As the days turned to weeks, I saw him follow her through the house like a shadow, agreeing to every change she suggested, carrying out tasks she assigned, and never once questioning whether they were right. My heart ached as I realized the son I had raised to be strong had allowed himself to be guided so completely that his own voice had nearly disappeared. It was then I understood that she had not only set her eyes on the house, she had also claimed my son's will as her possession, and without his strength, I stood alone against her growing influence. It was late one evening when I first overheard the truth slip from her lips, and though the words were not meant for me, They struck harder than any insult she had spoken directly. I had gone to fetch a book from the study when I noticed her voice carrying through the thin walls of the guest room, light and casual, but filled with a confidence that made my stomach turn. She was speaking on the phone, her tone bright with triumph, telling someone on the other end how clever she had been to marry my son, because it was the easiest way to secure a house without lifting a finger. She laughed softly, adding that she had already begun shaping the space to her liking, and that soon enough the place would feel like hers completely. My hand froze on the doorknob of the study as I listened, every word piercing the air like a blade, cutting away the thin hope I had clung to that perhaps I had misjudged her. She went on to say that my son adored her so much he would never question her, that convincing him of anything was as simple as smiling in his direction, and that in time the house would be transferred without resistance. I could hear the smugness in her voice, the assurance of someone who believed she had already won. My chest tightened as I stood there, hidden in the hallway, realizing I had just glimpsed the truth behind the mask she wore so carefully around me. It was not love that had brought her to my son. It was ambition, and not affection, that made her smile, but the certainty of ownership she believed was hers to claim. I returned quietly to my chair in the living room, my hands trembling as I opened the book I no longer wished to read, and I stared at the fire until it burned low. Her laughter from the guest room still echoed in my ears, mingling with my son's silence, and I knew then that the storm I had sensed from the beginning was no longer approaching. It was already inside the walls of my home, and it was only a matter of time before it tried to sweep away everything I had built. The breaking point came at the dinner table, a place that had once been filled with laughter and quiet conversations, now turned into a stage for her boldest move yet. I had prepared a simple meal, the kind my wife used to love, and I set the table with care, hoping perhaps the warmth of tradition might soften the tension that had been building in the house. My son sat quietly, his eyes fixed on his plate, while she spoke freely about her day, her voice carrying over the clink of cutlery like it owned the room. Then, without hesitation, she set down her fork, looked directly at me, and said the words that turned my blood cold. She told me that it was time I considered transferring the house to them, since I was getting older and would not be able to manage it much longer. Her tone was polite, almost sweet, but the message was sharp and deliberate, and in that moment I felt the sting of betrayal more deeply than I had ever felt before. My son shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing at her as if waiting for her to continue, and I realized he had known this moment was coming. She went on to say that it would be a wise choice, that it would ease my burdens and give me peace of mind, and that as newlyweds they could care for the property better than I could. Each word was delivered with the confidence of someone who believed the decision had already been made, as though I were merely a formality standing in her way. I kept my hands steady on the table, though inside me my heart pounded with the weight of her arrogance, and I forced myself to remain silent, knowing that any outburst would only feed her power. My son finally spoke, his voice quiet, agreeing that it might not be a bad idea to start discussing the future of the house, and in that instant I felt a part of me crumble, for the boy I had raised, the man who had once looked at me with pride, now stood firmly in her shadow. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the wall. And in that silence I understood that this was no longer a matter of suspicion or fear, it was the reality I had dreaded. My home, my legacy, the life I had poured into every stone, was no longer seen as a gift of love, but as a prize to be claimed. And that dinner marked the moment when patience gave way to resolve, for I knew then that something had to change, and it had to begin with me. That night after the dinner, I sat alone in the quiet of my room, the echoes of her words still ringing in my ears, and the weight of my son's silence pressing on my heart heavier than stone. The house was still, yet I could feel the presence of betrayal moving through its halls, not as a stranger, but as an uninvited guest that had taken root within the very walls I had built with sacrifice. My hands trembled as I touched the photographs on the nightstand, the smiling face of my late wife looking back at me, and I thought of all the years we had struggled together to create a safe haven for our family. I remembered the morning she rose before dawn to cook, while I prepared for long hours of work, the evening she sat by me as we counted every coin, saving and planning so that this home would never be lost to hardship. I thought of my son as a boy, how he would run across the garden, his laughter rising into the air like music, how his tiny hands once clung to mine when he was afraid of storms, and how I had promised him, silently and aloud, that he would always have a place of shelter here. To feel now that the woman he had chosen cared nothing for those memories, cared nothing for the labor and love embedded in every stone, cut deeper than any insult I had ever endured in my life. It was not only her words that wounded me, it was the realization that my son, the very child for whom I had given everything, stood by and allowed them to be spoken without defense. That silence was like a blade, sharp and cold, severing the bond between us in ways I had never imagined possible. My chest ached with the kind of pain that no medicine can soothe, for it was not of the body but of the spirit, the ache of watching love twisted into entitlement, of watching sacrifice turned into expectation. I stared into the dim light of the lamp, my thoughts heavy, and wondered if this was the fate of all fathers, to one day be seen not as a guardian of legacy, but as an obstacle in the path of ambition. I whispered into the stillness that my wife would have known what to do, that she would have reminded me that strength does not always come from confrontation but from patience and careful action. Yet in that moment all I felt was sorrow, a sorrow so deep it seemed to seep into the walls themselves, reminding me that the home I had cherished was no longer untouched by greed, and the wound it left in my heart was one that could not be hidden. As I sat with the weight of betrayal pressing against my chest, something within me began to shift, a quiet transformation that replaced sorrow with a steady and unshakable resolve. I knew then that I could no longer sit idly by while the legacy my wife and I had built was treated as a trophy to be claimed, for to do so would dishonor not only the sacrifices we had made, but also the love that gave meaning to every brick and every corner of this house. The time for grieving in silence had passed, and the time for careful planning had begun. I did not rage or shout, for anger often burns too quickly and leaves nothing behind. But instead, I allowed the pain to harden into something colder, a determination that would not waver no matter how many sweet words or false smiles were placed before me. That night, as the house lay quiet, I walked its halls slowly, my hand brushing against the walls that had sheltered me through storms, my eyes falling on the photographs that told the story of a family once whole. I whispered to my wife's picture that I would protect this home, that I would not allow it to be stripped of its meaning or turned into a prize for someone who had never lifted a hand to build it. In my heart I made a vow that her memory would not be tarnished, and that our son, blinded though he was, would one day see the truth of what stood before him. I began to plan not with haste, but with precision, reminding myself that strength lies not in loud declarations, but in actions carried out quietly and with care. Every decision from that point forward was measured. Every word I spoke weighed carefully, because I understood that winning this battle would not come from confrontation but from foresight. I resolved to secure the house in such a way that no scheme, no manipulation, no false charm could ever take it away from the hands it was meant to remain in. As I stood at the window that night, watching the moonlight spread across the garden I had tended with my wife, I felt a calmness settle over me. For I had chosen my path. It was no longer a question of whether I could endure their demands. It was now a matter of ensuring they would never succeed, and in that quiet moment my resolve became as unyielding as the stones that formed the foundation of the home itself. The very next morning I rose earlier than usual, the sun barely touching the horizon, and I dressed with a sense of purpose that I had not felt in years, for I knew it was time to take the first step in protecting what mattered most. I walked into town with my coat buttoned tight, my mind steady on the decision I had made, and though my body carried the weight of age, my spirit carried the weight of resolve. The law office sat on a quiet street, its windows lined with dust, yet within those walls I would find the shield I needed. The lawyer was a man I had known for many years, one who had handled small matters for me in the past, and when I sat across from him at his polished desk, I spoke plainly. I told him about my house, about the years of labor and sacrifice it represented, and about my fears that others had set their eyes on it with intentions not born of love but of greed. He listened without interruption, his eyes steady, his hands folded, as if weighing each word with the seriousness it deserved. When I finished, he nodded and told me that steps could indeed be taken, that the law offered protections for those who wished to ensure their property remained safe from unwanted claims. He explained how the deeds could be secured, how documents could be arranged so that no one, not even my own son or his wife, could lay claim to the house without my direct consent. He advised me to place everything in writing, to update my will, and to create legal boundaries that would hold firm long after words were forgotten. I listened carefully, each instruction settling into my mind like stones laid into a wall. And with every detail he gave, I felt the weight of fear lessen and the strength of determination grow. By the time I left his office, papers in hand, I carried with me not only the knowledge of protection, but also the reassurance that my home would not be lost to manipulation. As I walked back through the streets toward my house, I felt the air fresher, the light brighter. For I knew I had taken the first true step in defending the life I had built. My footsteps were slow but steady, and within me was the calm certainty that no matter what demands or schemes might follow, the house would remain mine until the day I chose to let it go. When I returned from the lawyer's office, I carried within me a calmness that no one in the house could see, for I had begun to prepare silently, moving with care so that neither my son nor his wife would sense what I was doing. I placed the documents neatly in a locked drawer, knowing that every page was a barrier stronger than any words I could speak, and from that moment I went about my days as though nothing had changed. I let her speak freely of her plans to modernize the house, to rearrange rooms, to bring in furniture she preferred, and I nodded without objection, for I knew that beneath her arrogance lay a false confidence that would only make my revelations sweeter when the time came. Each evening, after they had gone to bed, I would sit at the table with my pen, reviewing papers, adjusting my will, and writing letters that would ensure my intentions were clear long after I was gone. I thought often of my wife, of how she would have smiled at my patience, for she knew I was a man who believed in quiet strength rather than loud defiance. I moved carefully through each step, updating deeds, confirming witnesses, arranging signatures, making sure that everything was sealed by law and beyond contest. During the day, I carried myself as though I were indifferent, allowing her to believe that she was slowly shaping the house into her vision, But inside, I was building a wall higher than she could ever climb. My son noticed nothing, for he was content in his role, nodding at her words and smiling at her ambitions, blind to the truth that the house was already beyond her reach. I kept my silence, because silence was my greatest weapon, and with each passing day, I felt my resolve settle deeper, like roots anchoring a great tree into the earth. I told no one of my actions, not a neighbor, not a friend, because secrets, once spoken, can be stolen, but secrets kept are power. I watched her move through the halls with her confident stride, watched her speak to relatives on the phone as though the house was already hers, and I simply folded my hands, offering no challenge, for I knew the foundation of my home was no longer only wood and stone. It was guarded now by law, by patience, and by the quiet will of a man who had chosen to fight with silence rather than words. As the days turned into weeks, her arrogance began to bloom fully, like a flower that had waited for its season, and she no longer bothered to hide her intentions behind polite words. She spoke to visiting relatives with the confidence of a woman who believed victory was already hers, walking them through the rooms as if giving a tour of property she owned, pointing out where she planned to replace the old furniture, where new curtains would hang, and how she would redesign the garden to suit her tastes. I listened quietly from my chair, her voice carrying through the house with the tone of ownership, and though each word stung, I remained calm because I knew the truth she did not. She told one of my cousins over tea that the house would soon be theirs officially, that it was only a matter of paperwork, and I saw the cousin's eyes widen in surprise, though no one dared question her. At night she spoke on the phone again, her laughter sharp as she bragged that marrying my son had been the easiest way to secure a future, and that the house, with all its history and worth, would soon belong to her by right. My son sat beside her, smiling faintly, never correcting her, never defending me or the home he had grown up in. And each time I looked at him, I felt both sorrow and pity, for he was a man who had surrendered his will completely. She carried herself around the house as though she were already the mistress of it, rearranging items, moving decorations, even telling me once that I should consider staying in a smaller room to give them more space. Her voice was coated with sweetness, but her eyes shone with triumph, and she seemed certain that she had already claimed her prize. Relatives began to whisper to me in private, asking if it was true that I intended to give them the house, and I simply smiled, letting their doubts linger, for I knew the moment would come when the truth would silence her boasting. Each arrogant word she spoke was a stone she placed upon her own downfall, for the more she declared her victory, the deeper her pride rooted itself, and the greater her shock would be when she discovered that the foundation beneath her dreams had already been secured beyond her reach. The confrontation came on a quiet afternoon when the air outside was still and heavy, and inside the house the silence seemed to wait for something to break it. She entered the living room with my son at her side, her steps purposeful, her chin lifted, her eyes gleaming with the confidence of a woman who believed the moment she had been preparing for had finally arrived. She did not waste time with pleasantries. Instead, she placed a stack of papers on the table in front of me, papers she had no doubt prepared with great anticipation, and she asked me calmly to sign the house over to them. Her tone was sweet, almost soothing, but underneath it carried the firmness of command, as though she were speaking not to an elder she respected, but to an obstacle she meant to remove. My son stood beside her, his hands folded awkwardly, his eyes flickering between us, and though he did not speak, I could see in his expression that he had been persuaded to believe this was the right course. I looked at the papers, then at her face, and then at my son, and in that pause I felt the years of sacrifice, the memory of my wife, and the weight of every brick I had laid, with my own hands pressing against my heart. I did not raise my voice. I did not show anger. Instead, I folded my hands and told her calmly that the house could not be signed over, not then, not ever, because it was already bound by protections that placed it far beyond her reach. Her smile faltered for the first time, a flicker of disbelief flashing across her face, and she asked what I meant. I explained, still steady and composed, that I had visited a lawyer, that the deeds had been secured, that my will had been updated, and that the house was safeguarded in a way no trick or demand could undo. My son's eyes widened slightly, his mouth opening as if to protest, but no words came, and for a long moment silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of her breath quickening as the realization settled in. She tried to argue, to insist that families should trust one another, that love should mean sharing everything. But I met her words with the same calmness, repeating only that the matter was finished. Her face tightened, her charm slipping like a mask too heavy to hold, and in that moment the confrontation ended not with shouting, but with the simple truth, a truth that stripped her of the power she had believed was already hers. The shock on her face was something I will never forget, for it was as if every ounce of her confidence had been drained away in an instant, leaving only disbelief and anger that she struggled to hide. She had entered the room certain of her victory, certain that I would fold under the weight of her demands. But when I told her that the house was protected by law and that no one could take it from me without my consent, the words struck her like a blow she had never expected. Her smile vanished, her eyes widened, and for the first time since she had stepped into my life, I saw her mask slip. My son sat beside her, stunned into silence, his hands fidgeting in his lap, his gaze darting between us as though he had suddenly woken from a dream and did not know where to turn. She tried to recover quickly, forcing a laugh, saying that surely I was only being dramatic, that there was no need for such measures within a family, but her voice wavered and betrayed the fear beneath her words. I repeated calmly that the house was no longer vulnerable to schemes or persuasion, that it would remain mine until the day I chose otherwise, and the weight of my certainty crushed the false authority she had carried for so long. She pressed further, her tone growing sharper, asking why I would do such a thing, why I would not trust her and my son with the responsibility, and I simply told her that trust is not given blindly, it is earned, and that she had done nothing to earn it. Her eyes narrowed then, her voice dropping low, and I could see the frustration burning behind her calm exterior. For she was a woman who had always believed her plans could not fail. My son tried at last to speak, stammering about misunderstandings and urging me to reconsider, but I shook my head and reminded him gently that my decisions were final and that one day he would understand why I had taken such precautions. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the sound of her sharp breath as she realized that the prize she had envisioned slipping into her hands was locked away forever. The shock had cut her deeply, and though she tried to disguise it with another smile, I saw the truth in her eyes. For the first time, she knew she had lost. The moment of truth came during a family gathering when the house was filled with relatives, their voices carrying through the rooms, their laughter echoing against the walls that had witnessed so many celebrations before. She had been parading herself around the guests, speaking boldly of the future, telling cousins and uncles that soon the house would be theirs, and that she and my son would finally be able to make the changes they had planned. I listened quietly from my chair, my hands folded, letting her speak with all the confidence of someone who still believed her words carried weight. The relatives looked at me with curious eyes, some nodding politely, others whispering to one another, uncertain of whether to believe her declarations. It was then that I chose to rise, my steps slow but steady, my voice calm, but carrying enough strength to quiet the room. I told them that I wished to make something clear, not for myself alone, but for everyone gathered under the roof I had built. I explained that my home was protected by law, that no transfer of ownership could ever take place without my will, and that every paper had been signed to ensure this house would never pass through manipulation or deceit. The room fell silent as I spoke, and I could feel the weight of my words settling over every ear. Then I turned toward her and revealed what I had overheard, how I had listened to her boast over the phone that she had married my son to secure the house, and how her intentions had been clear from the beginning. Gasps filled the room, relatives shifting uneasily, their eyes no longer admiring but filled with judgment, and in that moment her confident smile collapsed entirely. My son's face turned pale as the truth unfolded before him, the whispers growing louder around us, each one cutting into the pride she had tried to build. I said nothing cruel, only the truth. But truth alone was enough to strip away the mask she had worn so carefully. She tried to laugh, to dismiss my words as misunderstanding, yet the silence of the relatives and the doubt in their eyes betrayed her. The power she once held slipped from her hands as quickly as sand through a sieve, and for the first time in front of the family, she realized that the image she had crafted was gone. The house was safe, her scheme exposed, and the respect she had so proudly demanded lay in ruins before all who had once believed her. After that gathering, the fall of her arrogance was swift and undeniable, for once the veil of charm had been torn away, there was no repairing the image she had so carefully built. Relatives who had once welcomed her with open arms now kept their distance, their greetings cool, their eyes sharp with suspicion, and the whispers that followed her from room to room were no longer whispers of admiration, but of doubt and disapproval. She no longer walked the halls of my house with the confident stride she once carried, but with quick steps and a tight jaw, as though the walls themselves reminded her of her defeat. My son, who had once followed her like a shadow, began to falter as well, his eyes heavy with confusion and shame, for the truth had been laid bare before him, and though he tried to deny it, the memory of that day could not be erased. I watched her attempt to regain control, offering sweet words to family members, trying to laugh off the accusations, but their responses were hollow and polite, stripped of the warmth she once commanded. The gathering she had dreamed of hosting in this house never came to pass, for no one wished to attend a celebration under the roof of a woman whose greed had been exposed. She spoke less often of her plans to remodel, no longer boasted about ownership, and though she still tried to hold her head high, the pride in her eyes had dimmed into something closer to resentment. My son grew quieter too, no longer bringing up the subject of the house, and when he looked at me, I could see in his gaze a flicker of regret, though he lacked the courage to speak it aloud. For me, there was no joy in her downfall, only a steady sense of justice. For arrogance always carries within it the seed of its own destruction, and hers had blossomed fully until it crumbled beneath the weight of truth. I carried on with my days as I always had, tending to the garden, walking the halls, sitting by the fire at night, but now there was peace in knowing that her shadow no longer loomed as it once did. The house remained mine, untouched, and her fall served as a reminder to all who had witnessed it that greed can never triumph over the strength of patience and the certainty of truth. In the quiet that followed those turbulent days, I often found myself sitting by the window, watching the sun rise over the garden I had tended for so many years, and it was in those moments that I felt the deepest sense of peace return to me. The house stood tall and unshaken, its walls still holding the laughter of my wife, the footsteps of my son as a boy, and the countless memories that had shaped my life. I thought back to the trials I had faced, to the arrogance of a woman who believed she could take what was never hers, and to the silence I had chosen as my weapon, a silence that proved stronger than her words. My son had grown quieter too, no longer boasting of the future she had painted for him, and though his eyes carried the weight of regret, I did not reproach him, for he was still my son, and a father's love endures even when tested. I knew one day he would see with clarity what had blinded him for so long, and perhaps he would remember the lessons of patience and strength I had tried to live by. The relatives no longer asked questions, for the truth had been made clear, and the respect I once feared was slipping away had returned, not because I fought with anger, but because I stood firm with resolve. I often walked the halls at night, touching the frames that held the faces of my family, whispering to my wife that the home we had built was safe, that her memory had been honored, and that our sacrifices had not been in vain. There was no triumph in me, only a quiet satisfaction. For true victory does not come from humiliating others, but from protecting what is sacred. I understood then that life will always test us with storms, some from outside and some from within our own walls. But the strength of a man is measured not by how loudly he resists, but by how wisely he endures and protects. The final word is this: my house remained mine, my legacy remained intact, and my heart, though scarred, found peace in knowing that love and patience had prevailed where greed had failed. And so I sit in my chair by the fire, watching the flames flicker gently, content in the knowledge that what was built with sacrifice will stand long after those who sought to claim it are forgotten. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.